Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because a lot of work went into uncovering the true events behind this story. This is not just any tale of survival. It's about an enslaved boy who was left to die after a deadly scorpion bite. And what happened 10 hours later shocked everyone who witnessed it. The events that followed changed the lives of those on the plantation forever. The boy's life on the plantation was harsh, defined by long days in the fields under the blazing Alabama sun, relentless work, and constant vigilance to avoid punishment from overseers. He was young, barely old enough to understand the full weight of the world he had been born into. Yet he was known among the other enslaved children for his quick thinking and resilience. Even though he was small, he carried himself with a quiet determination that set him apart. Each day began before dawn, with the shrill calls of the overseers echoing across the fields, and ended long after sunset, when exhaustion made the air itself seem heavy. He knew the dangers of the land, the snakes in the underbrush, the sharp thorns hidden among the crops, and the venomous scorpions that often hid in the shade near the cabins. But survival required him to navigate them all. On the day of the bite, the boy had been sent to fetch water from a well at the edge of the plantation, a task he had performed countless times before. The sun was high, the heat oppressive, and the air still, carrying the faint buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves. The scorpion was small, almost invisible, but lethal, and it struck with perfect precision, embedding its venom into the boy's ankle. Pain surged immediately, sharp and unrelenting, spreading with frightening speed. He cried out, but his voice was barely heard over the sounds of the fields and the overseer's commands in the distance. Despite the pain, he knew that showing weakness could draw punishment, and that any attempt to call for help might be ignored entirely. The overseers, upon hearing of the bite, debated briefly before deciding that the boy was beyond help. Some considered taking him to the plantation doctor, but fear of the boy's condition spreading and the belief that he would not survive led them to make a cruel choice. They left him to his fate. This was not an uncommon decision on plantations, where the lives of enslaved children were often deemed expendable. They returned to their tasks, assuming that within hours, the boy would succumb to the venom. Left alone under the oppressive sun, he was forced to confront the severity of his situation with no assistance, relying only on his wits, his instincts, and the sheer will to survive. The boy's surroundings were merciless. The well was surrounded by jagged rocks and dry earth, and the scorpion's bite had begun to spread its paralyzing venom, causing his ankle to swell and a burning sensation to climb up his leg. Every movement was agonizing, yet he could not remain still for fear of collapsing where he could not be found. Alone, he realized he had to act quickly, not only to manage the pain, but also to avoid being discovered in his weakened state by those who might exploit his vulnerability. The sun moved across the sky with relentless intensity, and as the hours dragged on, he began to experience nausea, dizziness, and weakness that made it almost impossible to stay upright. Yet despite the overwhelming pain, the boy's mind remained sharp. He recalled the lessons taught to him by the older enslaved workers, the remedies for minor bites, ways to clean a wound, and how to manage swelling with cold water from the well. He applied them as best he could, even while the venom coursed through his body. This knowledge, passed down quietly through generations, proved vital. It was not just the boy's physical resilience, but his understanding of the world around him. The survival strategies gleaned from experience that allowed him to endure the first hours after the bite. By the time the overseers had returned to the main fields, the boy was still alive, barely, but defiant. His determination to survive in the face of near, certain death revealed a resilience that would soon shock everyone on the plantation. He had not only endured the scorpion's bite, but had demonstrated a strength and presence of mind that no one, least of all the overseers, had anticipated. What began as a moment of expected tragedy was now transforming into something inexplicable, setting the stage for the events that would unfold over the next 10 hours. Events that would change the perception of life, death, and survival on that plantation forever. After the scorpion bite, the decision of the overseers to leave the boy alone was both cruel and deliberate. On the plantation, enslaved lives were considered expendable, especially those of children. When news of the bite reached the overseers, their reaction was cold and calculated. They debated briefly whether it was worth alerting the plantation doctor or bringing him inside for treatment. Some believed that any intervention was unnecessary, insisting that the boy would die regardless, while others feared that moving him might disrupt the daily labor schedule or draw unwanted attention to the oversight of supervising the young child. In the end, practicality, fear, and callousness won over compassion. The decision was made the boy would be left to die in the field, exposed to the sun, the spreading venom, and the unforgiving elements. They left him there, propped against a small tree at the edge of the field, thinking the wilderness would finish the job. The overseers returned to the main crops, their voices and whips echoing through the rows as though the boy's suffering was invisible. For them, his life was no longer a concern. He was merely a casualty in the ongoing business of maintaining the plantation. The boy, meanwhile, was acutely aware of his isolation. With each passing minute, his body began to betray him. The venom coursed through his veins, bringing intense pain, numbness, and a burning sensation that made even the smallest movement agony. His ankles swelled rapidly, and a wave of dizziness threatened to send him sprawling into the dirt. Yet, even in the face of abandonment, the boy refused to succumb. He had grown up in an environment that demanded awareness, resilience, and quick thinking. Years of watching, learning, and surviving under constant scrutiny had prepared him in ways that few could understand. Alone, he relied on instincts honed by necessity. How to move without drawing attention, how to stay calm under extreme stress, and how to manage the spreading pain as best as he could. He recalled overhearing older workers talk about minor remedies, about what plants could soothe a bite, or how to clean a wound, and though he had no access to herbs, he found ways to improvise with the sparse resources around him. Time became both his enemy and his ally. Each passing hour made his condition more perilous, yet it also allowed him to adapt to the pain and conserve his energy. He shifted his position carefully, avoiding sudden movements that could worsen the venom's effect. The sun rose higher in the sky, beating down on him mercilessly, yet he drew upon every ounce of willpower to stay upright. Birds and insects continued their indifferent activity around him, and the faint wind offered minimal relief, but the boy remained conscious, alert, and determined. Even in abandonment, the boy's mind worked tirelessly. He monitored the signs of his own body, his heartbeat, his breathing, the swelling and burning, and calculated how best to cope. At one point, he managed to scoop a small amount of water from the nearby well with a bent piece of wood, using it to rinse his wound and soothe the sting. It was a minor victory, almost imperceptible, but it reminded him that survival was still possible. The overseers, confident that nature would finish what they had left undone, were miles away, oblivious to the boy's resourcefulness. As the hours dragged on, a sense of isolation set in. The boy was not only battling the venom and the physical pain, but also the psychological weight of being deliberately left to die. The enormity of his situation could have crushed any spirit, yet he clung stubbornly to life. He understood that no one would come to save him, and that he had to rely entirely on himself. The cruelty of the overseers had inadvertently awakened a deep resilience within him, forcing him to confront mortality with courage and ingenuity. This period of abandonment set the stage for the events that would shock everyone 10 hours later. It was during these long, lonely hours that the boy's extraordinary endurance became apparent, not just physical endurance, but mental and emotional strength that allowed him to survive what should have been certain death. The overseer's assumption that he would succumb proved disastrously wrong. Their cold decision, intended to rid themselves of what they considered a burden, instead revealed the remarkable capacity of a child who refused to be broken. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the boy had endured everything the overseers had hoped would end his life. Pain, exhaustion, and fear had battered him, yet he remained alive. He had survived not because of intervention or luck alone, but because of instinct, resilience, and an uncanny determination to cling to life in the face of deliberate neglect. This set the stage for the unimaginable events that would follow. Events that would shock the overseers, the plantation, and anyone who heard of the boy's survival, proving that life, even under the most oppressive circumstances, can defy expectation in ways that seem impossible. During the 10 hours the boy was left to fend for himself, his condition worsened dramatically. The venom from the scorpion bite spread quickly through his body, causing intense burning, swelling, and numbness that crept steadily up his leg. At first, he tried to ignore the pain, focusing on controlling his breathing and staying upright. Every step, every small movement sent jolts of agony through him. But he refused to collapse completely into the dirt, knowing that losing consciousness could mean certain death. The plantation around him went on as if nothing had happened. The overseers continued their work, unaware that the child they had abandoned was enduring a life or death struggle that would become unforgettable. As the hours passed, the boy began to experience other terrifying symptoms. His vision blurred, the sunlight became a harsh glare that made it difficult to focus, and nausea rose in his throat, threatening to overpower him. His body temperature began to fluctuate. Chills ran through him even under the midday sun, while waves of heat left him drenched in sweat. At one point, he felt the sharp sting of his heartbeat in his temples, each pulse a reminder that time was running out. His strength was waning, and his small frame was pushed to the very limits of endurance. Despite this, his mind remained sharp, constantly calculating how to survive the next few minutes. The boy's cries began intermittently, though faint, almost swallowed by the sounds of the plantation. Every moan or whimper was an act of both desperation and hope, a reminder that he was alive, Each sound carried a strange intensity. Some of the nearby workers later recalled hearing faint cries from a distance, though no one had gone near the area to check. It was as if the boy's survival itself sent out a signal, a subtle energy that the natural world somehow recognized. Animals, too, seemed to sense his suffering. Birds flew nervously overhead, and small creatures in the underbrush kept their distance, creating an eerie silence around him that made the passage of time feel even heavier. Despite the overwhelming pain, the boy found ways to mitigate the effects of the venom, drawing upon instincts and memories of lessons overheard from older enslaved workers. He pressed makeshift pressure points on his ankle, shifted his body to avoid swelling, and cautiously used water from the nearby well to cool the inflamed area. These small acts were crucial in prolonging his survival. Every time he managed a minor relief from the excruciating pain, it renewed his determination to stay alive. Even as his body weakened, his mental resilience strengthened. He understood that giving into fear or despair could be as deadly as the venom itself. The boy's endurance was further tested by the environment. The Alabama sun was relentless, beating down on the exposed land. The air was thick with heat and humidity, making it difficult for him to maintain his strength. Flies and insects buzzed around him, adding irritation to pain, while the rough terrain made movements slow and dangerous. Any wrong step could worsen his injury or exhaust him completely. Yet, in the face of every challenge, he adapted. He learned to breathe slowly and evenly, conserving his energy, and to move only when absolutely necessary. His survival was a continuous negotiation between instinct and strategy. As hours passed, the boy's condition became critical. Dizziness threatened to topple him, and each heartbeat sounded like a drum signaling his fragility. At one point, he nearly lost consciousness, collapsing briefly against a tree trunk. But something inside him refused to surrender. Pain and fatigue became companions he learned to endure, not enemies he could fight outright. He pressed onward, inching toward shelter, drinking small sips of water, and focusing entirely on one thought: he would not die here. This defiance against the odds transformed his suffering into an extraordinary act of survival. The psychological aspect of those 10 hours was equally severe. Being abandoned, knowing that those who were supposed to protect him had left him for dead, weighed heavily on his mind. Yet, the boy drew upon memories of family, of moments when others had shown him small kindnesses, and the determination to live not just for himself, but for those who might care, even in a world so cruel. He imagined the relief on his mother's face if he survived. He pictured the horror in the overseer's eyes if he were found alive. These thoughts fueled his body, giving him the strength to endure the unimaginable. By the time the 10th hour approached, the boy was barely recognizable as the healthy child who had been playing in the fields that morning. His small body was bruised, swollen, and trembling, but against all odds, he was still alive. And it was at this moment, when every expectation had been overturned, that the events began to take a turn so shocking that those who would discover him later could hardly believe their eyes. What had been a simple act of abandonment had become a test of survival that defied both human expectation and the understanding of science. The boy's endurance during those 10 hours set the stage for the astonishing outcome. He had survived the deadly venom, the relentless heat, and the cruel neglect of those around him. His body had endured what should have been fatal. His mind had remained sharp under extreme duress, and his spirit had refused to break. The tale of his survival would ripple across the plantation and the surrounding areas, leaving witnesses speechless and forever questioning how such a fragile child could defy death so completely. The 10 hours alone became a testament to human resilience and a harrowing introduction to the miraculous events that were about to unfold. 10 hours after the scorpion bite, what happened was something no one could have anticipated. The boy, who had been abandoned and left to die, suddenly displayed signs of extraordinary survival that stunned anyone who came across him. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the overseers, convinced of his demise, returned to the edge of the fields to check on what they assumed would be a lifeless body. To their shock, the boy was not only alive, but sitting upright against the same tree where they had left him, his small body bruised and swollen, but remarkably alert. His eyes, wide and clear despite the ordeal, seemed to hold a knowing awareness far beyond his years, as if he had seen something during those harrowing hours that no one else could comprehend. The moment the overseers realized he was alive, panic and confusion swept through them. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing, their minds trying to rationalize the impossible. The venom should have killed him hours ago. Others argued, muttering about dark forces or divine intervention. The boy, sensing the fear around him, remained calm and silent, his breaths measured, almost eerily controlled. His survival alone was a miracle. But it was only the beginning of what would shock everyone present. As the overseers approached cautiously, intending perhaps to drag him to safety or punish him for surviving against expectation, something unusual occurred. The boy let out a single, piercing cry, sharp, clear, and unlike any ordinary infant's wail. Those who heard it later described it as a sound that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but inside their very bones. Animals nearby froze. The birds fell silent, and even the wind seemed to stop. It was as though the cry carried a weight far greater than its size or source, something that made the observers feel a chill run down their spines. That cry, strange and haunting, marked a moment that no one could explain. It was not just the sound of pain or fear. It seemed to signal something far more profound, almost like a warning. Immediately after the cry, a strange chain of events began to unfold. One of the overseers, a man who had always been harsh and cruel, suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest as if struck by an invisible force. Others reported a fleeting dizziness, a momentary vision of shadows moving unnaturally across the fields, and a sensation of heaviness that pressed down on them. The boy's presence, combined with the extraordinary circumstances of his survival, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously awe-inspiring and terrifying. Witnesses later claimed that, for several moments, it felt as if time itself had slowed around him, highlighting the extraordinary nature of what had occurred. In the hours that followed, more inexplicable events were reported on the plantation. The workers who had ignored the boy's suffering earlier now approached him cautiously, observing the swelling on his ankle mysteriously receding as he sat quietly. Some claimed that merely being near him brought a sudden sense of clarity or calm, while others described an uneasy feeling, as if an invisible force was testing their resolve. No one could explain how a child, left alone and envenomed, could survive, let alone display effects that seemed to defy natural law, the line between life and death, suffering and survival. had blurred entirely in those 10 hours. Word of the boy's survival quickly spread across the plantation and to neighboring lands. People came to witness the phenomenon, half in curiosity and half in fear. They observed a child who had endured hours of agony, who had been presumed dead, and who now sat quietly, breathing steadily, and whose cry had shaken the very people who had once thought him expendable. Rumors began circulating about divine intervention, about miracles, and even about curses. Everyone who encountered him, from the youngest enslaved worker to the plantation owner, left unsettled, wondering how such a fragile human could withstand what nature and human cruelty had stacked against him. By the time night fell, the boy had not only survived, but seemed transformed in some unexplainable way. He moved with a careful precision, showing an awareness of his surroundings that was uncanny for his age. His cries, though occasional, were said to carry a strange power, a sound that seemed to forewarn misfortune or elicit awe from those who heard it. Even those who had treated him cruelly now viewed him with a mix of fear and reverence. The boy's survival was no longer merely a story of endurance. It had become an event that challenged the understanding of life itself, blurring the boundaries between natural law and the inexplicable. In the days and weeks that followed, the plantation community remained on edge. Workers whispered about the boy's uncanny resilience, while overseers debated among themselves whether his survival was purely miraculous or the result of some force beyond human comprehension. Everyone agreed on one thing: the child had endured the impossible, and his cry marked an event that none would ever forget. That single moment, 10 hours after the bite, became a turning point in the boy's life and the lives of everyone around him. A moment that transformed him from an ordinary enslaved child into a figure whose survival would be talked about for generations, a living testament to endurance and the mysterious power of life itself. The aftermath of the boy's miraculous survival sent shockwaves through the plantation, leaving both the workers and overseers struggling to comprehend what had occurred. Word of the impossible event spread quickly among the enslaved workers, who had witnessed, either directly or through whispers, the 10-hour ordeal and the astonishing cry that seemed to defy explanation. For them, the boy's endurance became more than a story of survival. It was a symbol of resilience in the face of cruelty and a reminder that life could assert itself even in the harshest conditions. Many who had seen him during those 10 hours could not stop talking about how small and fragile he had appeared, yet how his presence carried a force that seemed to ripple through the air, unsettling animals, workers, and even the overseers. The overseers, who had initially left him to die, were deeply unsettled. Some were struck with guilt, though few admitted it aloud, while others were shaken to the point of fear. The boy's survival challenged their understanding of the natural world and their authority. They had assumed that abandoning him to the venomous bite would end his life swiftly, but the sight of him alive, his ankle slowly healing and his eyes full of awareness, created a sense of dread among them. It was as if the boy's mere existence, after those 10 hours, had rewritten the rules they believed governed life and death on the plantation. Even the harshest overseers felt a subtle hesitation when issuing commands afterward, unsure if their authority could extend to a child who had defied death itself. For the enslaved community, the boy became a figure of whispered reverence. Mothers and older children spoke of him quietly among themselves, describing his survival as nothing short of miraculous. Some began to interpret the event as a sign of divine intervention, believing that the boy had been spared for a purpose beyond human understanding. Others feared that the incident carried consequences yet to reveal themselves, that the survival of one so close to death might disturb forces beyond mortal control. The boy, however, remained unaware of the reverence he had inspired. To him, survival was instinct, a matter of staying alive in a world that offered him no guarantees. Yet even in his innocence, the impact of his survival rippled through everyone around him. The plantation itself seemed to respond to the event. Workers reported small, unusual occurrences in the days following his ordeal, animals behaving erratically, sudden chills sweeping through the fields, and strange, fleeting shadows at the edges of the fields at dusk. Some attributed these occurrences to superstition, while others whispered that the boy's survival had unsettled something fundamental in the natural order. Even as daily life resumed, the tension lingered. The memory of what had happened 10 hours after the bite refused to fade. The boy's mere presence reminded everyone that life could be more unpredictable than they had ever imagined. The wider community eventually heard rumors of the event, though details were often exaggerated or altered with each retelling. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about a child who had survived a scorpion bite that should have been fatal, and who had cried in a way that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. Some saw it as a warning, others as a miracle, but nearly everyone agreed that it was extraordinary. The story traveled, shaping the perception of the plantation and its inhabitants, and ensuring that the boy's survival would be remembered long after the initial incident. Meanwhile, the boy himself continued to grow, and though he appeared outwardly unchanged, the experience had left an indelible mark. He moved cautiously, aware of the fragility of life, and developed an acute awareness of his surroundings. Elders on the plantation noticed that he seemed different, more attentive, more attuned to the subtle signals of the land, the weather, and the people around him. They spoke quietly of how the child had been touched by something beyond ordinary comprehension, how he carried the weight of his survival in ways they could not explain. The overseer's fear did not subside. Many became hesitant to punish or discipline the boy in ways they might have with other children. The fear was subtle but pervasive. The boy had survived the impossible, and even their authority seemed diminished in comparison. The incident remained a cautionary tale, not only for those who witnessed it, but for generations that followed, illustrating that life had a strange and unpredictable power that could overturn human assumptions and control. Ultimately, the aftermath of the boy's survival reshaped the dynamics on the plantation. The enslaved workers found a renewed sense of hope and resilience, while the overseers were left with a lingering unease. The boy's 10-hour ordeal became legend, a story retold at night, around fires, and in hushed tones, a testament to endurance, mystery, and the profound unpredictability of life. Even years later, anyone who spoke of the boy's survival agreed on one thing. What had happened was beyond explanation, and the cry that marked those 10 hours remained etched into memory as a signal of something extraordinary, something that neither cruelty nor nature could entirely conquer.